morning, Snake. Good morning, wardrobe. Good morning, TV. Good morning, sink.
Jack sort of becomes everything. His lack of understanding that there's anything outside of this room is something that Ma really grabs onto, and they sort of co-create that together because it's so much easier to think that there's nothing outside of this room than to realize all that is being missed.
Where do we go when we're asleep?
Right here in room.
But dreams. Do we go into TV for dreaming?
Mm-mm. We're never anywhere but here. And in a lot of ways, it's a really beautiful relationship because they only have each other. And when you have 11 feet by 11 feet of space, the rest of it just becomes imagination and what you make of it. Do you remember how Alice wasn't always in Wonderland?
She fell down deep in a hole.
Right, well, I wasn't always in room. I'm like Alice.
When I read the book, I had really strong images kind of stuck with me and a kind of feeling and a sense of what the tone should be, which is where I usually start, and just a kind of an emotional register that the film would be in.
I've always been a little bit fascinated by some of the true stories that were coming out around the time the novel was coming out as well, but it really didn't occur to me that it would work in a visual medium.
You spend 40, 50 minutes, the first half of the film will be in a room. I've never done anything quite like that.
Ethan Tobin, the designer of the film, and Danny Cohen, the DP, we worked for a long time and in great detail, particularly on the room. How realistic versus how kind of fantastical do you make it? I was pretty clear from the beginning that I wanted it to feel very truthful and realistic.
More so than any film I've ever worked on, the inspiration for the design process on this came from research. I found myself pulling obvious references like the Fitzel dungeon, J.C. Dugard's residence, Ariel Castro's home, as well as the incredibly small apartments in Hong Kong and how people manage to live in tiny spaces. So it became sort of a meditation on what to do in a tiny space and how people live with limited resources.
Why don't you make a UFO out of this?
So we sort of started with a very broad canvas, and it became a bit of a creative experiment of what we would do ourselves if we were stuck in a small environment with a child.
Cut.
So we're here in this enormous soundstage where we've built an incredibly small set.
It's so small.
So we are in the set. You can see the dimensions are pretty much as they were in the book. I mean,
Slightly bigger than the book.
yeah.
But it feels so small.
Yeah. Ethan Tobin, the designer, said that it was one of the smallest sets he's ever built, but it was one of the ones that he spent most time on because every detail is important. It's the space that the child has inhabited for their whole life. So every corner of it is significant. Every mark he makes, or the pictures they draw, the ways in which they use, reuse, repurpose the objects that they have.
Every item and every object needs to have its own story. Things like the flotillas in the toilets become little worlds for Jack to inhabit.
So it's not that every single detail is just like in the book. It's not that literal a translation. It's more that he's given every object a backstory.
So for example, something like the cork, which we started scratching as though he had scratched it, did oil stains as though their heads were touching that very same spot for year upon year, night after night. Scratches in the door where the door would open every day. Even the idea of places where Ma may have tried to escape. In the book, everything's covered with this cork, and it just seemed like a missed opportunity to do something really interesting with materials. What's great about these sound tiles are, number one, and most importantly, they're realistic. If you're trying to insulate sound, they make sense. And they sort of create this incredible landscape that a boy like Jack would find almost magical.
Ethan put together a design that made it very filmable, so he could move bits of the walls could come out quickly, or bits of the furniture, the wardrobe could disappear if we needed to. So everything was modular.
We went through a lot of different approaches to that, and what we decided on was the idea of sort of building a Rubik's Cube from the inside out. Each one of these squares would be removed.
You can remove any panel that you want and shoot through into the room. And actually, in fact, all the floor comes up as well, so that you can get down really low.
One of the first conversations we ever had was talking about light studies for an environment that doesn't exist. So, as scripted in the book, there's one lamp and one window.
This was an addition that we made, which was the fluorescent light, because we felt that with 3 light sources, the skylight, the lamp, and the fluorescent tube, you could create like really infinite number of combinations.
And the little green glow from
The little green glow from that.
That was a bit sinister.
There's a radiator down there which glows a little bit red.
We would introduce light through a little bit of film trickery from radiators, toasters, televisions that have been left on. Those are all major events in our tiny world where they dramatically change the color and intensity of what we're putting up on screen.
And we don't repeat ourselves too often. So I think that, so visually, as a member of the audience, I think if you understand the scale of it through how we kind of use the camera and the relationship with the actors, then I think that's, what we were trying to achieve.
When I was writing the book, I was really aware that I was being like old Nick. I was designing this place and keeping them in it. But of course, you're literally doing surveillance.
Yeah, no, we are absolutely
It's like a very complicated spy cell.
Emma's incredibly flexible for a writer who has a piece of fiction that's been so fully embraced by the public. She would help guide us, but that she'd stand back and let our own creative process find its feet.
Oh, look at the scored surface.
Emma seemed very able to just be there as an interested observer and as somebody who was fascinated with the process, but there was never any tension around the shooting.
And I think we all agreed, just as Ma is confined to this space, so should we in as many ways as possible. Whenever we worked in the most confined environment possible is when we found we would get the most naturalistic performances and moments.
And the amazing thing is that Bree's a great improviser, but so's Jake. He's so small, but he loves the freedom of being able to kind of run with the scene. So the actors have a lot of freedom.
I'm a dragon. I'm a dragon.
That's why it's so amazing you're filming it in sequence, and I know how unusual that is, but it's allowing everybody to kind of get a real sense of the story and of the enormous way everything will change when they get into the outside world.
Exactly. I mean, you never have that luxury. It's amazing. I've never shot in sequence. And you can feel your way through it. You can allow each scene to have its effect on the scene that follows.
Am I still gonna go?
No, not this time. We shot in chronological order for the whole sequence of Room, which was about a month long. And I discovered so much of her through that process, and it becomes a part of you. But if this was actually a room and there's 2 people living in an 11-foot by 11-foot room, it's not a lot of space for 2 people. But when you have 8 camera and sound people in there, it gets really difficult.
Mark it. 20.
It's a pretty grueling process, and the film itself takes over, and the gravity of that is the biggest force in your life.
It's the room that you really don't see in the book, because
Yeah.
Jack doesn't see it that way. So it's far more Jack and Ma's stories, sharing
Absolutely.
the perspective, and it brings out so many new things.
If you're lucky, I think, it feels like the book has kind of reconstituted itself, regenerated itself in the film, and that's a good feeling.
You're gonna love it.
What?
The world.